Today is November 12th, 2015. Kay Wagner and Sarah Battison are with Dr. John E. Clemons, retired otolaryngologist. Dr. Clemons was a surgical resident at Gunderson and returned to practice from 1968 to 1996. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Clemons. Please tell us how you chose to become a physician.
Well, that's kind of a long story, but I'll tell you my background. I grew up on a farm in New Auburn, Wisconsin, which is the lower part of Barron County, and on the Barron County-Chippewa County line. And on that farm, when I was about 14, after my dad had died when I was 11, my uncle gave me a lamb that was rejected by the mother, and so I fed it on the bottle and raised it. Well, then this sheep grew to an adulthood, and I took her over to my uncle's place and had her bred, and she had twins, and a buck and a ewe, and so the lambs have to have their tails docked, and also the male lamb has to be castrated if you want to raise them as a meat producer. And so I began to have experience doing that, and then the flock grew in size over the years, and I did this each year, learning how to shear my sheep and take care of them. My mother made it my responsibility, and if I wanted to go to a basketball game, I needed to get my chores done first. And so it taught me responsibility, I think. And then after my father died, we moved to Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin, which was a little larger school, and I had a better educational facilities. And from there, I was introduced to the University of Wisconsin River Falls by my agriculture teacher. And so we visited River Falls, and that's where I decided I was going to go to college. I was the first one in my family to go to college. Some of my cousins later on went to college, but no one in my immediate family had gone to college. And so I was pretty proud of that. And I worked hard in college, and I got reasonable grades, but I wasn't studying pre-med to go to medical school. So then it was a circuitous route that I took. I was in my last quarter of my senior year to graduate in ag education, to be a vocational agriculture teacher. And I went home at Christmas, and my mother had broken a bone in her foot, and she was going to visit our local physician, who had been our physician for years. And I said to my mother, "I'd like to watch surgery." And she said, "Oh, John, if you're going to be a doctor, that'd be okay, but I don't think you should ask him." Well, knowing me, I asked him anyway. And he said, "Sure, come on up to the hospital tomorrow morning. I've got quite a few surgeries." So I went up and watched him, and that was to change my life, because I said, that's what I want to do. I went back to college, and I started talking about it to all my friends. And in fact, I talked so much about it that one of my friends fainted when I was talking to him, because I was too descriptive about the surgery I'd seen. And at that time, I was living with a professor and his wife, and the wife's brother was in medical school, freshman in medical school. And he was kind of an angel, because he decided that I was going to go to medical school. And so, unbeknownst to me, he found out what courses I had already taken in college, and then he went to the dean of the medical school, which was great of him because I never talked to the dean when I was in medical school, and found out what courses I'd have to take yet, and there were only 5 courses that I had to take to complete my pre-medical requirements. From there, I had a problem because my agriculture courses, such as farm power and farm buildings and all that, were at the same time as my pre-medical classes. So I went to my advisor, whom I knew really well because I'd worked for him during the winter remodeling houses and so forth. And I said, I was thinking about going to medical school. Oh, John, that's great. I said, well, I have a problem. Your class and my invertebrate embryology class are at the same time. So what are we going to do about that? He said, you go to your pre-medical classes and you forget about the agriculture classes because you had enough good grades and we know you well. And so just forget about my classes. And I did that. I never took a test in his class and he passed me right on through. So anyway, that was kind of the start of my medical school. So then I thought, well, I will have my agriculture degree to fall back on if I don't make it through medical school. So I have got an education anyway, and so it's worth a try. So that summer I went to Madison and took an organic chemistry course. And I had a wonderful professor there that was a good teacher. And I needed some money, so I interviewed at the university hospitals, and they hired me as an orderly. And so I spent a lot of my time emptying bedpans and doing all the things that orderlies do, and financed myself through that. Well, then I completed that course, and I had taken courses at River Falls too, so that was the only course I had to finish up on, except for vertebrate embryology, which I had done down there. And so then I went home to Chippewa Falls and stayed at my home in Chippewa Falls and worked at the Northern States Colony. And there, the former principal of our high school was the administrator out there, so I got a job right away, and I worked in the ward with very children that had to be fed and clothed and so forth. And that was a new experience, and they were very good to me. They even let me come to their conferences when they staffed children. And then after that, in March, I got a letter from the University of Wisconsin, Dr. Gale, that I was accepted to medical school, and I would be starting in September. So fellow student from River Falls and I drove down to Madison, and I stayed at the Phi Chi House, and we started our medical education. Well, I loved every bit of it, and I tried to do my best, and I did all right. So I'm, I think, 18th in the class of 70 people or something like that. So anyway, then I wanted to, how did I get to the Gunderson Clinic? Well, you may want to know that. I I interviewed at different hospitals, and I interviewed at a hospital in southern Wisconsin, and I decided to go there. But then I got a letter from Dr. Sig Jr. saying that they'd raised the stipend for interns and residents here. And I said to Arla, well, I think I'm going to go to Gunderson then, because it's near our homes, and Arla's home was in Waukon, Iowa, and mine was in Chippewa Falls. And so it was a good, chance to study medicine and be near our homes. So I started my internship here, and then I did real well, and then I decided to take a residency in general surgery, because I thought maybe I could go out in general practice and see patients and do surgery. Well, after working with Dr. Sig Jr. and Dr. Adolph, and we opened a belly and found something we didn't expect, I thought, boy, I better get better trained if I'm going to practice medicine. I can't go out and do surgery on somebody and then find out that I can't complete the operation. So I started thinking about what specialty I should do to further my education. And I decided, well, Jerome was going to come back and practice and establish the OB/GYN department. And he and I had gone to medical school together. And so I knew him well, and I thought, no, I wanted a practice that involved surgery and yet seeing patients of both sexes and of all ages. And I had circulated with Dr. Aiken in my internship, and he suggested that if I applied either Minnesota or Iowa. I wrote to Minnesota, and they said I'd have to, it'd be a 5-year program. Oh, I thought that's too long. Well, then I wrote to Iowa, and this is unbelievable, because as I applied for the University of Iowa, another resident who had the position from Iowa decided he didn't want to go for 5 years, he wanted to go for 4 years, and he moved to Illinois. So I just fell right into that place, and I was the last appointee of Dr. Lyerly, who was the father of otolaryngology, and I almost turned that residency down because he said, well, you have the residency, John. I said, well, I should talk to my wife about this, because she supported me through medical school, and I don't know if she wants to support me for another year. And he said, well, you go home and talk to her, and you write me a letter right away if you want to do it. So I went home and I talked to Arla about it, and she said, well, what's another year? So she has been very good and all the way through my medical education. And so then I wrote and was accepted. Then what happened was that I asked him later whether I could take my second year of general surgery here at Gunderson, because I was having such a good experience. He said, okay, but the reason he did that is because some other resident just a few days before me talked him into letting him go to another hospital for his general surgery. So I just fell into that position. So I stayed here, and my second year was very fruitful, because Dr. Eric had just returned from England, and he was going to set up the heart-lung program. So they assigned me to work with him and to help Dr. Sig Sr. He wanted me to help him all the time, and because he was kind of slowing down in his practice. He must have been about 70 years old or more. And so Dr. Eric was very wonderful, and I unpacked the first heart-lung machine here, and I wrote an article for the Bridges about how did otolaryngologists get involved with the heart-lung machine and bringing dogs and calves from his Sig Senior's farm to practice their surgical techniques in cardiac care. So anyway, that's kind of the how I got into medicine and at the Gunderson Clinic, and chose my specialty. You know, the Gunderson Clinic ENT program was not well established when I started. Dr. Perry Walters was the first fellow doctor here, and he died of a stomach cancer at a young age. Then I think it was Dr. Ridout who followed him, and so then when he died, then they hired Dr. Aiken. Dr. Aiken was minimally trained at Walter Reed Hospital, but he didn't really do any modern ear surgery.
This kind of leads into how you established the department and all the work associated with that.
Right. Well, I can tell you about that because it was a hard job. First of all, there weren't the proper surgical instruments. I needed to order all of the instruments for middle ear surgery, mastoid surgery, along with the drills and so forth, and all the cleft palate and cleft lip instruments. And so I brought from Iowa City photographs of all the surgical trays and the names and numbers of the instruments, so that I ended up having to teach my nurses the names of the instruments. And so Miss Lester at that time was just sort of semi-retiring from being chief of medical surgery nurses. And so she became my right-hand woman, and what a wonderful person she was. I don't think I could have done it without her. She would practice learning the instruments. I think she took some of them home at night and started memorizing which ones are which. And the nurses used to say, "Oh, you're going to scrub with Dr. Clemons on an ear case? You better know the names of the instruments, because he's the only one that knows all of the instruments." But anyway, then we had to, I would grab an orderly and I'd have him lay down on the table, and we would practice draping the patient and going through an operation such as a stapedectomy, and I'd call for all the different instruments I used. Same way with a laryngoplasty or mastoidectomy. And so that's how was one part of establishing the department. I think the greatest development that occurred in the history of surgery was the fiber optic light and the laser light, because it changed what we could do, and it changed how gallbladders were done through 3 little holes instead of a large incision, and bronchoesophagology was much easier to do with a good lighting. When I started in Iowa City, I was trained in all this. We had incandescent bulbs, and just as you get down the bronchus, the light would burn out, and you'd have a problem. So I thought that was a great addition, the laser. And the laser is used now for stapedectomy and all those things. So, and urology surgery and so on. So anyway, those are some of the fond memories I have here, working with Dr. Adolph, Dr. Sig, Dr. George Murphy, and Dr. Leiby and Schultes. I also had a good experience of my second year with Dr. Eric. That was wonderful. He was very good to me and taught me a lot of techniques and let me do quite a bit of his surgery, his closing and opening and so forth. Well, my practice was doing well, and during those 3 years before I developed rheumatoid arthritis, I was able to establish the head and neck surgery program, and we had illustrations out at the mall about non-smoking and not using tobacco, and that was real early before people really started talking about that. And I got involved in a national program that was directed through the University of Wisconsin. Then I started seeing patients that had had cleft lip and palate surgery, and they had deformities and had things that needed to be corrected. Well, I called the University Hospital in Madison, and I knew the professors there, and I asked them, "What are your plans for so-and-so, little Johnny?" Who's little Johnny? They didn't know anything about him. So then I invited the pediatricians to come up, and I talked to them about the problems and told them what my training was. And so we were able to establish the first cleft lip and palate program here. And that's been wonderful because I've made friends with some of the patients that I operate on. And I can tell you about a little girl from Arcadia that I took care of. She was just a shy little thing. She never talked to me. And I did her cleft lip and her palate. And one day she called us 20 years later and wanted to know if we'd like to go out to lunch. And so she and her brother came down, and Arla and I had lunch with her. And Arla she couldn't tell that she had ever had a cleft lip and palate. But her speech was perfect, and her lip and everything looked good, and her nose looked good. And that's a lot of the things that need to be done with the cleft lip and palate patients. They have to have secondary procedures until they're about 18, until they graduate from high school. And many of my patients, we got them all fixed up before they had their graduation picture from high school taken. And then they would send me their pictures, and that was really heartwarming. But that was how and then you wanted to know how I started the outreach program, which became so popular. Well, in Iowa, when I was a resident, they had a program where they would bring patients to the hospital from out locally by cars, and then they had programs where they flew us by airplane, little Piper Club, out to southwest Iowa, northeast Iowa, northwest Iowa, and we would see children there that had problems with their ears and hearing. And I always thought, well, they send these patients into the university hospitals to be taken care of, and it's a good patient load. But, a lot of these operations could be done out in the local hospitals. They don't have to necessarily come all the way to Iowa City. And so I had that in the back of my mind when I came here And so one day I mentioned it to Dr. Tex Carlson, who was the administrator, and I said, I'd like to go out to see patients in Winona. And so I always thought that the ENT practice had a few surgical instruments for TNA and so forth and tubes. And so I thought they could be done at the local hospital. And I knew that patients from a smaller town did not want to drive to a larger town to be taken care of. So we went to Winona with Dr. Eric and Dr. Tex Carlson, and they okayed me coming up there once every 2 weeks or so, and that worked out well. Well, Dr. Carlson thought I was going to order a $3,000 chair to examine patients in, and instead they had an antique iron chair there. It was straight up in the back, and you had to spin the seat around to raise it up and down. And I said, "Oh yeah, that's okay. I can use that," you know. So that made him happy, because after I had ordered all the instruments and the equipment that I needed for surgery, he said, "John, that was quite a chunk." And we still laughed about it. He asked me about a miraculous day that I might have had, and I guess that would have been the reattachment of the severed auricle that was bitten off. So anyway, that's how was my most miraculous day, and it was just because I got called in the middle of the night at 2 in the morning saying they had a man in the emergency room who had been here at the Pizza Villa, and the bouncer from one of the bars had followed him there because of an argument and gotten in a fight. And he wanted his ear reattached. I said, "I don't know if I can do that." And but I went in, and it all worked out well. We thinned his blood and did a different technique, and it became known as the Clemons technique in Iowa City anyway, because my chief, Dr. McCabe, asked one of the residents one time who had tried to reattach an ear, and he said, "Did you use the Clemons technique?" And Dr. Krause said, "Well, no." He said, "Well, you should have if you wanted to take." But anyway, that's how it became known as the Clemons technique. And so that's kind of the background of that. Do I have any advice or words of wisdom to young physicians? Well, yeah. I guess be kind to your patients, because they come in to see you and they're worried about themselves, and they may not act like they normally do because of their fear of what you're going to do. And I recall one of my patients who had a cancer of his lip, and he was afraid. He finally came in with his wife, because she probably drove him in there, and I started talking farming to him because he was a farmer. And he wanted to know, what did I know about farming? And I said, well, I grew up on a farm, and I know quite a bit about it. I know that sometimes the nodder on the grain binder doesn't work, and you got a problem. And we became friends after that. And I did his lip, and he survived that. And so I think you need to be kind to your patients and not judge them by your first visit. I've made friends with several of my patients. One from Iowa City that I operated on her voice box, and she was a teacher, retired teacher, and I've got a box of letters that I have still from her that she wrote to me frequently. I've written my autobiography. It's entitled "Tending My Flock." It's here beside me, and I enjoyed writing that. I did it. I started writing it while I was still practicing. I had a nice word processor, and I could type because I took typing in high school for a couple of semesters, and I just sat down with a kind of a guide and started recalling all the things they asked me. Tell me about your house, what it looked like. Tell me about your relatives and so forth. And then I kind of stopped doing that because I was busy in practice. And then in after I retired in 1997, then I decided I'd better finish it. So I finished it in Arlen, and I worked hard with a person from Sparta and published it.
You mentioned that there was a physician that you worked with when you were first operating, and that must have been when you first observed surgery.
Oh yeah, my hometown physician, Dr. Sasma.
Did you stay in touch with him?
Yes.
Yeah.
In fact, he came to my book signing in Blummer, Wisconsin, and he was 98 years old when he came there. And I always said, well, I'm going to come to your 100th birthday. But unfortunately, he died before he got to the 100. But I was so pleased that he showed up. For his daughter brought him, and I had written about him, and I gave him one of my books, of course, and he had read it. And he was my physician father when I graduated from medical school. We had a physician from the university and he walked down the aisle with me, and then he spent time with us. Arla had fixed the lunch out at our apartment, and I met his son, who became the district attorney for Chippewa Falls, and later, and so that was, I always gave him credit for getting me interested in surgery and letting me come up and watch him, which changed my whole life, you know.
It did. I think one of the questions that we've asked is, what would your colleagues say that you are known for? And then what should you really be known for? I'm thinking you were so involved in so many areas at Gunderson. Do you have
Well, I asked Dr. Seeger and Dr. Severide. We have lunches at Diggers on Thursdays, and they said I was their mentor. And I guess by mentor they mean leader and teacher. And so I was glad to hear that. And they told me that I was a good teacher. We had established a residency program at the University of Wisconsin, and also with Madigan General Hospital and so forth, with residents here, and taught them mastoid surgery and so forth, head and neck surgery. So Dr. Conley always talks about my ability to do middle ear surgery. He talked about it at my 80th birthday party and said, told everybody what a meticulous surgeon I was for the middle ear. And he laughed and told a story about how I came up to him and I said, Dr. Conley, I've been redoing all your ear cases. And he said, well, I think I'll stop then and start doing plastic surgery. Well, I had a good laugh about that. So, yeah, I was their mentor, and I tried to get my colleagues involved with running the department. And I called Dr. Seeger last night to ask him what he thought about that, and he thought it was a good idea. I turned over the chairmanship of the ENT department to Dr. Seeger first for 2 years, and then after that, Dr. Severide took the position, and we passed it down the line until I ended up with Dr. Daly, and I thought they would get the experience of administering and the problems that we have, and going to the department chairman meetings and so forth. And he thought it was a good idea. I said, well, I had this idea and I don't know if it was good or bad. I wanted to get your opinion about it. And he laughed and said, no, he thought it was a good idea. He learned some things too about administration, that you can't satisfy everybody, and they always got somebody to complain. Yeah.
I was kind of interested in your thoughts about medical education and research and those type of activities that it seems to me enriched the entire experience of practicing there, I would think.
Yeah. At Iowa City, I did research in transplantation of tympanic membrane, and the pathologist would send me temporal bones, and then I would put them in eye storage kits, and then it gave me a lot of practice in doing ear surgery. I could practice all the tympanic membrane and everything I wanted to do, and handling the instrument. So it was a good research project. And I don't know, some of the things I did here, I guess, kind of research, the outreach and and setting up the surgery and all this was practice. I remember when my professor from Iowa City flew me up here to have a visit with Dr. Carlson, and when we flew back, he said, boy, do they ever need an ear, throat, nose, and throat doctor here. I wouldn't come here for $1,000,000. He said, it's going to be a lot of work. Well, I knew the people here, and it was just like coming home to practice. Dr. Adolph was very good to me and Sig, and so it was an enjoyable place, even though it was hard work. And then, in those 3 years, I did all those things, and then, oh darn it, I developed a pain in my shoulder one day, and it got worse, and I finally ached all over, so that Dr. Newcomer sent me up to Mayo Clinic to one of his friends up there, and they diagnosed me with rheumatoid arthritis. So I've had that for 65 years, and it's been a chore. But I read in the paper this morning, one of the obituaries, there's a nice-looking guy, and shows him when he was younger, and then in his older age. He developed rheumatoid arthritis at age 40. Well, I was 35, and he experienced all the same things that I experienced. It was interesting reading his obituary and how the struggle with pain and disability and so forth. And that was a very difficult time in my life. And Arla supported me real well. I was started on gold shots, which was a technique at that time. We didn't have the new biologics that we have now, but every week I'd have to drive up to Mayo Clinic. They would test my blood, then they'd decide what my white count was, and if it wasn't right, I'd drive back home and have to drive back again next week and get a gold shot. And that helped, and then I started improving, but I had to go on disability. I had to apply for Social Security disability, and we had just purchased a home, and so we had that to worry about. But Arla said, some people got it worse, and then other people, and at least I thought, well, I'll have to live with it, and at least I don't have cancer, and I'm going to die in 6 months or so. So it's kind of the attitude that you have, but it's been a long, hard struggle, and I'll have to admit that. And they have the new biologics now, which are wonderful, and I was on that while I was in practice, and it was I did very well on it. It was on Enbrel, cost us $1,200 a month or something like that, but we made it through. And but then one day, we were riding back in a bus from the State Fair, Minnesota Fair, and my hands started to swell up. And I'd washed my hands good before I got on the bus. And by the time I got to La Crosse, my hand was all puffy. And I thought it was just the arthritis. Turned out to be it was an infection. And so that ended. Once you have an infection, you cannot take another biologic like Humira or Zanchas or whatever again. And but I've had good care from the Gunderson Clinic. All of these people are my colleagues, and so.
I was gonna ask you in terms of going through this, and you obviously had you built the department at that point, so
Yes.
that was a blessing, I'm sure.
Yeah.
To have the
I got done all that in the 3 years before I came down with arthritis, and then as a godsend, Dr. Severide, who I'd worked with in Iowa City as a resident, he started practice here, and so he brought the same techniques and everything that I had done. So I always give him credit for what he had done. And Dr. Seeger had trained at the New York University and stopped in on his way out to New York from Colorado, but he had met some of the Army doctors out there, I think maybe Dr. Overholt and Linda Smith and so forth, and they had told him about this place. So he stopped in, and it was just the thing he wanted. So he was a godsend too, and I was so busy. So I give them all credit for all the help that they've done for me, helping me with my arthritis and so forth, covering call sometimes, and when I didn't feel good,
and building a department that took care of people the way
Yeah.
you wanted them
Yeah.
taken care of, even
Yeah.
when you couldn't.
Right. And they were kind to their patients too, and were good surgeons.
So, is there anything else you would like to add?
Well, I think if anybody wants to know anything about my life, they should read my book, Tending My Flock. It's on. There's a couple copies, I think, in out of Gunderson's library. Joe Teat, he was wonderful. Joe Teat was at Wisconsin, and then he came up here at Gunderson, and Joe had his office across from me when I had an office when I was a second-year resident. So we had a lot of camaraderie together, and I never hesitated to call Joe in the middle of the night to see a photograph a bad accident case and so forth. And those were wonderful pictures that he made. In fact, there's one that's in my book of Dr. Severide and I doing an examination of a patient in cleft palate clinic. And that picture, you go to several departments around the country, and that picture is on the wall in the ENT departments. And he got a recognition for that, I think, that photo. And that, I think, is on record in your department in audiovisual. So he was a wonderful guy, and he had suffered from tuberculosis, and he had half his lung removed when he was younger to recover from tuberculosis, and he was kind of always short of breath, but he was very proud of his work. And he had to develop all his own films and everything. He had water tanks there. He was always developing pictures of, and worked hard. So I'm so glad when Paul Fish told me that they had named the audiovisual department Joe Teat department, and he deserved that. So that was very thoughtful on Paul Fish's part. Yeah, it was good years. I lived through a lot of history at the Gunderson Clinic. I remember you when you were 12, 14 years old, swimming out at the island, and I brought my nephew out. He was about the same age, and you were kind of eyeing each other, but that was kind of fun. They were always very kind to me and welcomed me out there to go swimming or bring my family out. So, yeah, the Gundersons have been very, very generous and kind to me. I saw the development of the whole history of the Gunderson Clinic, all the people coming, contributions they made. Riley Loker, who's not with us anymore, and it was just at Digger's Lunch, when we have a tradition that when it's your birthday, you buy everybody a drink or else a dessert, and there were about 8 or 10 of us, all of the people that Dr. Larry Lindesmith and Dr. Fink and so forth. And I drank it. I toasted them on the fact that we were all part of the growth and development of the Gunderson Clinic. And I don't know, I think this history piece is good for other young people coming here to learn about why we're here and what went on before them, Well, I think we practice very good medicine. There isn't many other places where you can go in the door with one problem and be seen by several physicians, walking them across the hall and say, "Here, I want this guy to see you," and bringing them to my daughter lives in Mesa, Arizona, and they have a terrible problem out there. If she wants to see a physician, she needs a referral, and then if there's x-rays, she has to go someplace else to get the x-rays, and then it takes a week or two to get back, and you got a broken arm and you need it set, and it's just a problem. And fortunately, we have one of my residents practicing in Phoenix, and so I can call him up and I get an appointment for her right away, because she's a teacher of gymnastics, and she uses her voice a lot, and she's works in a dusty environment, and sometimes she gets hoarse, and so I can call up Thad, and he says, "Oh, John, good to hear you. Yeah, send her in." So it's a great place we have wonderful medicine here in La Crosse.